Europe and the US when it comes to doing human factors engineering. What kind of things, when it comes to human factors, what kind of things really grease the wheels with the FDA and make things go smooth with the FDA? And then really that next item, that fifth item, human factors engineering best practices. I'm going to spend most of my time there. Like, really, how do we do it? What's the best way to do human factors engineering to make sure that everything goes well with the regulatory and you get the best result? So that's where we're going to go. And then Jan's going to pick up with software as a medical device. Okay, so first and foremost, what is human factors engineering? It's important to understand what we're talking about. And perhaps many of you, you know this well and it's obvious. To some of you, maybe it's just been a buzzword and you're not sure. But human factors engineering is all about the capabilities and limitations of the users of our devices or systems that we're developing. So, we're extremely interested in focusing on what are the user's capabilities, what are their limitations, and how does that play into how we're going to design our device and make it innovative. And it's all about understanding those, because capabilities and limitations obviously lead to and speak to potential hazards and risks in how the device might be used. So from a definition standpoint, human factors, and the reason it's important to point this out is because in Europe and most of the world, it's just called usability engineering. In the US and in other places, it's often referred to as human factors engineering. And those two things are really synonymous, but there are some differences in how we go about it, which we'll talk about in a second. But what human factors is, it's a discipline that quantifies, and that's important. We're trying to quantify human performance and then the capabilities and limitations, like I said earlier. So sometimes these type of things seem really sort of objective or subjective, and we're trying to quantify something that can sometimes be subjective. But it is data driven, so we're collecting data, and it's defensible to regulatory bodies. And of course, it's used to mitigate use error and safety issues that arise from use error. And of course, fourthly, it's compliant with guidance from regulatory bodies. So, the activities that we do in human factors engineering, of course, we try to align them with some of the regulatory guidance that's out there in the industry. And we'll look at some of those. And on the right here, I'm just showing some of the guidance from 62366, which is a European, but also worldwide guidance document. And you see 10 things there that are sort of activities and deliverables that are important in 62366. So you see, first and foremost, there's the documentation of the process in a UE file. So, we have that same thing. We have a human factors engineering file, and that file is the collection of all of the documents from all of your human factors or usability activities, kind of in one place that you'll pull from that file and use items from that file in your regulatory submissions. And secondly, it's the identification of the most important characteristics relating to the use of the device. So that takes some insight into looking at the characteristics of, and it says device here, but I think device, system, software, like anything we're putting together, the identification of those characteristics that are related to the use, and then identifying frequently used areas, and then identifying hazards or hazardous situations that are related to usability in those frequently used areas. We're identifying all of these things. And then the device's primary operating functions, and then it goes into things that we make them. We make a usability specification, and then we have to have a validation plan, and then there's the work at designing and developing our device or system and the user interface with that device or system. And then we have our verification, we have our validation. So these are all activities, deliverables, and these are pretty similar among different guidance documents. Slight differences, but the general same theme for deliverables. So human factors is really delivering all of these things. And if there's any recurring theme in what we're talking about here, you'll see that if you look at these activities and deliverables, they start very early in your development process, and they span the length of the development process. So it's not like a one-time event where you jump in you do some work, and then you jump out. This work follows along with your development process and your design controls. All right, so that begs the question, when do we start human factors engineering? So human factors or usability engineering, to me, is all about understanding the truth behind the innovation that you're trying to develop. What's the truth behind what the users need and how your device or system is going to operate, and the link between those two? What's the truth there? And I love this quote by Albert Einstein, where he said, if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes finding the solution. So he's putting this emphasis on understanding the problem, defining the problem, and understanding it. And that's really the heart of human factors or usability engineering, is defining that problem so we can understand it. And the beauty of the 5 minutes to find the solution is if you have defined that problem so well and understood it so well, the solutions almost begin to present themselves to you. And if that's the case, then you can spend much more time being innovative with those solutions rather than spending all your time, searching for those solutions. So that's the heart of it, and it really is all about design research. So defining that problem is really a design research activity. And as developers, designers and developers of medical devices, design research is something that we always do. It's always important to us, no matter what the project is, how big or how small. We have to research into that truth that I was describing. And we have to do some design research so we can inform our design, so we can understand what the best approach is going to be, rather than just running with an idea that we think will work and then testing it. The whole idea of user-centered design is we need to do that design research first. And so human factors engineering is very much a design research type activity. So when we think about how it fits into the development process, this is a snapshot of the chart that we use at Kablooey Design for the entire development process. We call it D3, which stands for design-driven development, because user-centered design, which is at the heart of human factors engineering, really drives the process. So you can see in a process like this, and this may be very similar to processes that you all use and have seen, but you've got all of your groups over here that are involved in development. And then you have your stages of development here. So this is kind of your design controls, and your stages, and your design history file spans these stages, and these are the phase gates that you go through. And then these are all the activities that occur and all the decisions that have to be made with those activities. And what I've done here in green is I've highlighted the activities that the R&D team is deeply involved with. So, the designers, the engineers, these are the tasks that we're involved with. But when you think about human factors engineering and usability engineering, we're talking about a linear process here, and we're talking about a lot of iterations occurring in a linear process. And that's the beauty of the process, is you have to make sure that you've got the ability to iterate on your design solutions throughout a linear process. So it's linear, but it's cyclical at the same time. Well, human factors engineering feeds this process because it starts right here. It starts early in the process, and your early usability studies and your early contextual inquiries occur here. And then you have subsequent usability studies and formative studies that occur and feed those iterations as you go through the process. So it begins early at that early research phase, and then it continues out through the iterations of the development process. So we engage in it early. So how does it look across continents? How is this perhaps slightly different in Europe compared to the US? And what do we look for in the US? Well, the best way to sort of take a look at this issue is to look at some of the guidance documents. And so these are the 3 guidance documents that at Kablooey we pay the most attention to. And there are other guidance documents out there as well that are good and useful, but I like these the best. So 62366 is a European and international standard for human factors or usability engineering. HE75 is the American national standard for human factors engineering, and 1757 is an FDA and CDRH guidance document. And the point I'm making here is These guidance documents, for the most part, they share a vast amount of similarities, and they are meant to harmonize. They reference each other in their guidance. However, there are some slight differences and maybe differences in emphasis in these, and that sheds a little bit of light on maybe what's important to the regulatory body in the US compared to maybe what's of higher importance to regulatory bodies in Europe and other places. And some of the biggest differences, and there's a handful, and again, these differences aren't huge. There's a lot of harmonization between how this is done, but some of the more visible differences are that the European system, it asks for a user interface specification. The US FDA systems, they don't specifically ask for a user interface specification, but they do describe a lot of tasks that have to be done during that early part of your human factors engineering, the part where 62366 is asking for a user interface specification. So the US sort of focuses on, well, there's all these tasks that have to be done, but it stops short of asking for a specific report, which 62366 asks for. And then later on, it just asks you to sort of populate what you've learned in those into other parts of your process. So that's one difference. The second one is that US systems, they seem to want to see a lot of preliminary work to your summative study. They want to see the work that got you to your summative, what you were thinking prior to your summative protocol. A lot of those steps that you went through in your human factors engineering prior to getting ready for your validation, they want to see all that ahead of time. Where in the international systems, there's a bit more focus on just the results of your validation, wanting to see the results of your validation. And again, neither one of these systems is saying that it's not important. It's just where their emphasis lies. And then lastly, the US system, it puts a lot of focus on analytical steps and analysis tools. Like it talks about using a user failure mode and effects analysis or using a fault tree analysis. And it really pushes to show these kinds of things in your documentation and have the results of those show up in your validation. And in the international models, it's not, they tend not to like push specific things like that so much, although there are a lot of descriptions for what you can do. And again, my note is that these are general differences. They're not hard and fast rules, and things change fast. You know, every few years they update these documents, and any one of them might begin to put a different emphasis in a different place. But this is just what we've seen over time. If we look at the guidance documents and take a hard look at them, we can see that the emphasis of 62366, it's looking at the process and it's applying human factors and usability to medical device design, and it's really considering risk management. And its goal is to integrate these usability engineering principles and your user interface design practices into the development of your product. So its focus is on process and the union of usability engineering and risk management together. Excuse me, whereas HE75, it's a very comprehensive reference. So it includes a lot of general principles, the management of use, error, and risk, design elements and solutions, excuse me, and its goal is to provide a relevant source of human factors information and design criteria and guidelines and things like that. So its focus is really on the tools that you use to go through this process and the methodologies that you would use as you go through the process. And then lastly, 1757, its emphasis is describing activities that really maximize the likelihood that you're going to have a successful regulatory submission, specifically with the FDA. So it's sharing these practices, and it's a shorter document, but its focus is really on having a really smooth experience with the FDA. So those are the differences. They're all very important, and we like to use each one of these guidance documents in our process, you know, for these particular emphasis. And I encourage you to look at them in that light. Okay, so making the FDA happy. This is important. There's a few big things that you can do. Obviously, following all of the guidance documents makes them happy. But some big things is provide them all of your human factors engineering data before your summative, which is your validation. It's because they want to help you evaluate and form your summative protocol. They want to make it more effective, and they want to make sure you have a higher chance of success in your validation. So they want to see a lot of this. So you do that in your pre-submission meeting or in a successive pre-submission meetings. They're also big on doing your summative or your validation before you have large clinical trials. Um, it's a general guide than a rule. They acknowledge there's exceptions. Obviously, sometimes you have to use your clinical trials as your usability or your human factors validation, but they prefer to see it beforehand, because if you can validate your usability before you use it on actual humans, they get really happy. That makes them happy. And the third thing is you could avoid human factors engineering altogether. They want you to do a usability risk assessment early in the process. And if you do that usability risk assessment early, you could make an argument that human factors engineering isn't needed, because for every one of those critical use areas, you could show that the likelihood of occurrence is very, very low, and the severity of an occurrence is very, very low in every situation, and you wouldn't even need to do it. That doesn't always happen, but it's a possibility, and you need to look at that and make that case to the FDA. If your users are patients rather than clinical people, you're probably going to have to do it. If there's risks with predicates, you're probably going to have to do human factors engineering, okay? But otherwise, you can make that case. So in the next 10 minutes here, I just want to share some best practices with you, and then we'll switch gears and we'll go into software as a medical device. But I think best practices are important. So we've talked about, how what all this is. Now I want to talk about, how do we do it? How do we really do it and get the best bang for the buck when we go through these sort of things? So one of the first keys to remember, and this is a big key, and a lot of these best practices, they're going to be theoretical in nature. They're going to be philosophical. It's a way you approach it. It's a mindset that you have when you approach your human factors engineering. This is one mindset right here. When you go into human factors engineering, you're taking a close, hard look at user needs. However, the best practice and the best results is to make sure that you're also looking at all of the little needs surrounding the big need. Example, your user need may be around heart attacks, myocardial infarction. You might be working on a device that is meant to detect myocardial infarction earlier, okay? And there's a big user need around detecting this early. You could just focus on that one user need. However, if you really dig in, there's going to be a lot of little tiny needs surrounding that need. For instance, when a physician is addressing a patient or evaluating a patient with chest pain, maybe they're using tools, maybe they're doing observation, and maybe those tools are difficult. Maybe there's difficulties in how they observe, how they interact with the patient, how they test, and there's all kinds of difficulties. If you pay attention to those little difficulties that are surrounding the big need, you are going to do what Albert Einstein suggested, and you're going to define that need much better, and you're going to have innovative solutions that meet that user's need far better than you ever would have otherwise, and potentially far better than your competitors. And you're going to have a far more innovative device. So how do we do this? We spend a lot of time doing ethnography. Ethnography is like being a fly on the wall, and it's observing what happens to get at that truth about what our users need. There's a few different ways we can do these sort of observations. We can go into an actual use environment, use working prototypes, have real users, us as researchers, we're observing, and there can be real subjects, real cases, or there can be test subjects, but we're getting there and we're watching what the users do, okay? We can also do simulated uses where we create a simulated, that says actual environment, it should say simulated environment. But we use working prototypes, and we have real users with prototype devices in a simulated environment. We observe, and there's no real subjects. It's just in vitro test subjects. That's another way to do it. It's great. We can also have what's called a cognitive walkthrough, where we have a simulated environment. We've got working prototypes, and maybe there's no real users, and there's just a bench test, so it's in vitro, and we're walking through and we're having somebody cognitively explain what they go through as they do this, and we're looking for things, okay? These observations are very important. Different types of prototypes can be used during these observational ethnographic studies that we do. There can be very simple ergonomic models that help us understand usability in terms of ergonomics, shapes and forms, and how they interact. There can be user interface models that have a limited amount of functionality and it shows how a user is going to interface with it, but it doesn't really function. Then we can have semi-functional prototypes that have a certain amount of functionality, but they may not be actually delivering therapy. But it tells us a lot about how the user is going to interface with that device in a simulated observational study. And then we can have these fully functional prototypes where we 3D print parts and we put it together and it actually works, and we go into an animal trial and we're watching the therapy actually get delivered. And that can tell us a lot of things. Okay, so a lot of different levels. These are all good methods that you can use at different levels. Obviously, during the beginning, you're using simpler things, and towards the end of the development process, you're using more complex things. But when we're observing, we're thinking of our observational arena as a play, as if we're going to watch a play. There's actors, and we want to pay attention to the actors and what they're doing. There's props. We want to pay attention to the props, just like at a play. There's a stage, just like at a play, and we want to pay attention to the stage. And then there's action, and we want to pay attention to the action. Too many people just pay attention to the action, but we have to pay attention to all these things because it's going to tell us the truth about what's going on, and it's going to be that 55 minutes of defining the problem in a deeper way with all those little needs surrounding that big need. So when we do this, we think to ourselves, okay, here's a key to a best practice. We could just watch and say, that's interesting, or write it down. We go deeper and say, let's define everything that that user is doing. Let's break it into 8 steps. They're going to go through these 8 steps. They're going to define, they're going to locate, they're going to prepare, confirm, execute, monitor, modify, conclude. These are steps they're going to go through. Why don't we look for what it takes for them to be successful in every one of these steps and what the pain points are in every one of these steps? And why don't we log those? So we do that. And it really starts to get deep into the process. It really starts to show us what's going on in every one of those small steps around the big step. And I think I have a frozen computer here that's locking up. But nevertheless, I was getting close to the end of what I was sharing anyways. So let me just kind of continue with this, and then we can make a switch. So as you go through these steps, and again, this is what we consider a best practice, that not a lot of people do this, but this is going to help you get all those little needs surrounding the big need. As you look at every one of these 8 steps and you're watching a user go through all these, you want to do 4 things in every one of these steps eventually. While you're watching, you want to watch for metrics in every one of these steps and jot them down. So a metric is asking yourself, what does the user need to do in order to be successful in each one of these 8 steps? So say in the prepare phase, well, what is the user needing to do to be successful, to prepare? Are they setting up an area? Are they pulling items in? Are they opening things up? What is it that they have to do? Are they organizing stuff? And you get this through interviews. You get this through those ethnographic observations. You get this through a lot of things. Second of 4 things is you look for pain points. What was difficult? What slowed them down? What caused them to be confused? You're jotting those down as pain points, and you're associating each of those pain points with a metric that it came from, and you're writing that down. So this is a lot of information. Okay, then when the observation is over, you go back and you take every one of those pain points and you write every one of those out as a user need. And this is where you get your list of user needs. Now, if you do it the way I'm describing, you get a lot of user needs. So instead of just watching something and writing down 8 things that were interesting, you're literally walking away with 80 pain points, and it can get to be a lot. But you write a user need for every one of those, okay? And then what you want to do is you want to rank those user needs. So you have users and engineers and corporate people and key stakeholders and experts rank these user needs on a scale of 1 to 5. And we have something called an opportunity algorithm that we run on those user needs, and it ranks them. And you get a list of which ones are the most important that you should address. And then you take that group of user needs and you rewrite them as user interface requirements. And that's your list of user interface requirements, which are a subset of your overall requirements. And the FDA calls these design inputs, because these are the inputs that are going to go into driving how you design your medical device or your system. And those are the user interface part of the design that goes into that, okay? And so the FDA likes to call those design inputs. And in your DVT, your design verification testing, that's part of your design controls, you're going to go through your verification, and your verification is going to address those user interface requirements and those design inputs. And you're going to see if the device that you've made, the prototypes that you're doing, you're going to test those with users and see if they actually fulfill those design inputs. So that's how you design. So that list of user interface requirements, that's your gold mine at the end of all of this human factors engineering, because that's what you use to make sure that your design matches that. And if it does, you're going to have a highly innovative, but also a highly adopted medical device, meaning adopted by the users in the market. Why? Because if you use these best practices, you're going to have defined all of those little needs surrounding the big needs, and you're going to meet the needs of your users in such a more deep and profound way that the users are going to see your device as more innovative than competitors or whatever else is out there on the market. And they're going to adopt it into their work and their life much better. So those are the best practices in a nutshell. I teach, this can take a semester to learn. I've given it to you guys in 10 minutes. So obviously, if there's any questions, we're at the point now where we're going to switch over to our software part. But if there's any questions, I can grab some now. Otherwise, we can take some at the end. Tim, is there anything that we should address from a question point? Mm-hmm.
There are a couple talking about that major need and the surrounding needs. How far do you go? You want to spend 55 minutes on defining the problem, but how do you ensure that you only spend 55 and not the full hour? Where's the limit to how far you would go in this?
Yeah, we limit it to what we find in our discovery. So one of the things you have to submit is you have to submit a human factors engineering plan. That's part of your submission. And in that plan, you've defined how many studies you're going to do. So you might say, we're going to do a couple of early studies where we're just testing the waters. And then we're going to do 2 formative studies where we're being a little more forthright and we're using prototypes of a higher level. And then we're going to have our validation studies. So we're going to have 5 studies. And in those 5 studies, this is what we're going to look for. Okay. So then when you do that, when you go through those studies, by the time you get to those formatives, you're doing what I've described here. And you're pulling, let's say, we'll walk away from a study, we'll literally have 90 pain points. And the way that we assure that we don't go too far is by using that opportunity algorithm where we rank those 90 pain points in terms of satisfaction and importance, meaning how satisfied is a user right now if we didn't address this pain point? If we just let it go, how satisfied would a user be on a scale of 1 to 5? And then how important is it to a user that this pain point gets resolved on a scale of 1 to 5? Okay. And then we take a look at those rankings and we get numbers. And then we decide, okay, out of those 80 pain points that we now have written as user needs, everything that's above a 5 seems reasonable to address. Everything below a 5 is ridiculous. We're not going to address those things. I mean, it wouldn't even fit our mission statement. So you make a cutoff point, and then suddenly we say, okay, now we're addressing 18 user needs. And that's a good amount. Our designers and our engineers now can focus on 18 user needs. And that's how we make sure we don't go too far. But we start by gathering a lot and then addressing out of that massive amount of little needs surrounding the big need. That's how we make sure we address the relevant ones and the ones that really get at the truth of what the users need to be successful. Hopefully that answers the question.
That was a good answer. So yeah, I think so. Yes. Then there's another one that is, and that's now it becomes a little bit specific, but sometimes user guides are used when you cannot lower the risk of the product, the usability of the product by design, and then you use the user guide to lower the risk to an acceptable level. Is that considered bad design, or is that a symptom of something else, or is that just that's just the way life is?
That is the lesser of 3 evils. So the guidance documents put out kind of a good, better, best. And when you discover through your testing that something needs to be improved from a user interface standpoint, the best of 3 options is to change the design of your device or your system. If that can't be done, the next best thing is to sort of put a Band-Aid on top of it. Like, let's say it was a button is getting pressed by accident. Maybe we can put a shield over the button so that it's adding something to your design. That's the second best thing. And then the last, if that can't be done, the last thing is, okay, could we put some instructions in our user guide and tell the users, be aware of this, avoid this, don't do that? And the answer is yes, that's a way to address risk, but it's not the best way to address risk. It's kind of a last resort.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. I think we are ready to move to the software part and to Jan.
Okay, and then to stop sharing my screen, I believe did I just stop sharing?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. So Jan, hop in.
Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Jan Jewiadomski. I'm with Intelligent Product Solutions. I'll give you a very quick introduction. We're a product design company based in New York. We're under the same forward group as Kablooey. We're currently about 85 engineers and designers. We work on a variety of projects, a lot of them medical devices. Our current clients span from startups to our largest medical device company right now is a $85 billion company. So we have a fair amount of experience in a variety of the issues that are faced in terms of medical device design in the US, and also in terms of some of the transition from products that were designed in the European Union or Korea or Japan, and transitioning those to the US. So let's see. I'm trying to share my screen. I'm not sure if it's.
Yeah, you're good.
You're sharing.
We're good. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to follow a similar agenda to the human factors engineering. I'm going to give an overview of what's considered software as a medical device. The definition is very similar to what it is in the EU. What are some of the differences in terms of the regulatory landscape? And then, because this is a very huge subject, we're just going to focus on a few items that we've observed and that are pain points in terms of getting started with the development of software as a medical device, and obviously continuing the development. So what is software as a medical device? The FDA refers to software functions that are medical device functions as device software. This could be the software in a medical device. So, for example, the software that controls CAT scan, X-ray. If you're in the medical device industry, you're aware of a lot of the software that's tightly coupled to a device and has to follow development standards. Software as a medical device is used for one or more medical purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. So that means that it's not necessary for a hardware medical device to achieve its intended medical purpose, meaning it can run on general purpose hardware, standard PC, a tablet, and it's not dependent on another medical device. Mobile medical apps can fall into either category, and we'll discuss that a little further. And even health monitoring apps, the FDA has taken the position of monitoring them and determining whether to exercise any oversight. So we're not going to read through all this, but essentially a high-level software as a medical device would be intended to diagnose, help cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent the disease. And in the FDA's view, that also includes some veterinary applications. So it's can be in vitro diagnostic purposes, can run on general purpose platforms. It's not considered software as a medical device if its intended purpose is to drive hardware. In that case, it is part of the hardware medical device. It could be used in combination or interfaced with them, but if its critical function is performed in a standalone mode, then it's considered software as a medical device. Mobile apps that meet that definition are also considered software as a medical device. So the definition can also include providing means and suggestions for mitigation of a disease. So this could be an app that makes recommendations for diet, exercise, and at some point, it's important to be mindful of that because certain claims that may not apply in certain countries or jurisdictions could apply in the US. If it provides information for detecting symptoms, whether it's tracking metabolic factors or things like that, or aiding in diagnosis, again, based on tracking, then this can also be considered software as a medical device in the FDA's view. And finally, there's a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence being applied in these fields. And this adds a lot of complexity and increases the dependency on the quality of data, which we will get into. So I hope this gives a good definition of what software as a medical device is and isn't. So EU versus US. So even though the FDA is part of the IMDRF, and a lot of the standards are very similar and have been harmonized, there are some additional requirements for marketing a medical device in the US. The manufacturer, the entity marketing it, has to be registered. The device has to be listed, depending on the class. It has to be, the FDA has to be notified or must approve it. The quality system needs to be in place. As Tom mentioned, there are some key differences between the focus in specifically the EU and the US. Medical devices in the EU tend to focus more on the end result, the technical file, the test reports. This has been changing, as you're probably aware. In the US, there's a lot more focus on demonstrating compliance with the process as well as the end results. So ensuring that requirements are being captured early, risk management is being performed early. The FDA wants to know what are the names of individuals who approved design reviews, approved changes. And the purpose behind all this is to create accountability, but also to ensure that when there are changes, that they follow through the process of risk analysis and risk management. As we know, with software, the temptation might be there to make a simple change that may not affect anything else. And certainly with software, it seems easier to make the changes than with hardware. So following that process becomes especially critical. So we've seen when medical devices are being migrated from a product developed for the EU to the US, while the same results may be valid, demonstrating the development history of the device and attaching the names of the reviewers, the dates, and demonstrating that the whole sequence has been followed is a key difference. So these are really in addition to like ISO 13485 and 14971 for risk management. Labeling, the FDA also takes interest in any marketing claims that affect the class of the device, instructions for use, indications for use, things like that. Medical device reporting, there's regulation requiring that a company has a system in place for receiving and tracking complaints and taking action on the basis of those complaints. And then the HIPAA, it does include a privacy rule, which again is probably not extremely different from current privacy rules in the EU, but there are differences to be mindful of. In addition, there's a regulatory requirement for cybersecurity by the FDA. There's guidance to ensure that medical devices, if they are connected, are secure. So some design considerations. If you've worked on software for a medical device that is part of a medical device, you'd be familiar with 62304. This also applies to, this is the golden standard for development of software as a medical device. And the focus is always on risk management and a risk-based decision model. So to start, the criticality of the software as medical device category drives the level of risk management that's needed and the level of process adherence, security and privacy. And it also includes human factors engineering. Quality management, verification and validation is, again, an important part of the software development. And again, this is a very large topic, but we'll focus on just one part, which is really the data and some things specific to data in the US. And then finally, methodical and systematic systems engineering. So the currently defined software as medical device categories are based, the categories are based on the criticality of the outcome. So the most critical would be category 4, which would mean it is used to treat or diagnose a critical condition. So software that reviews an X-ray image or an MRI image, CAT scan image, and makes a determination of the presence of a tumor, a blood clot, and is critical for driving treatment would be a class 4. And again, as the conditions get less serious, the category number drops. And if it is used to drive clinical management or just inform, again, the criticality drops. The overall development life cycle, the inputs coming in are in general, this covers a lot of the software as a medical device life cycle and function. You're taking in a variety of patient data, lab results, images, could be x-rays, hyperspectral, multispectral images, ultrasound, a variety of sources. And an algorithm is ultimately analyzing that data and comparing it against either reference data. So in a lot of cases, this is where machine learning and AI come in. It's compared against that reference set and is producing an output, which is used to inform, drive, diagnose, or treat. And the risks and benefits are largely related to the risk of an inaccurate or incorrect output, because that ultimately impacts the clinical management of a patient. And a big part of ultimately getting the software as a medical device cleared is the clinical evaluation. And some of what that has to ultimately demonstrate is the answers to these three questions. Is there a valid association between the output and the condition that's targeted? Does the software correctly process the input data to produce an accurate result? Can you demonstrate that that the logic that's implemented in the software is accurate? Because even if it just provided a random answer, it would be 50% right half the time. So how does the software actually generate that output? And then finally, the validation, which answers the question of whether the software's output achieves the intended purpose. Is it a useful output, even if it's accurate? So this cannot be accomplished without good data management. And that's why we're going to focus on the importance of the data management. So we're going to cover a few things that we've seen. This is, again, a very large topic. We're going to focus on a few items, and so that we'll have time for questions. So one of the main pain points that we've seen is the data availability. So in the US, and maybe if you go across countries in the EU, you'd find the same thing. A lot of the data is fragmented and requires curation and standardization. And one of the things to be mindful of is avoiding selection bias. So there may be a large healthcare organization that can provide a large amount of standard data. However, that data may only represent a certain section of the applicable demographics. So getting data that is representative of the full intended population and avoids the selection bias will often mean having to assemble data sets from very fragmented and different sources. Data quality most available data and anything with a long history is generally meant to be human readable. So it can include duplicates, missing or irrelevant data that a clinician can easily ignore, and so these things can identify and ignore. So these things are not always corrected. Sometimes you may have images that are mislabeled. Example would be from dental x-rays, for example. They can sometimes be saved upside down, just because that's how the image can easily be taken in either orientation. And these would have to be corrected at some point before being used for as reference data. There's also a lot of things such as notes, freeform text, which is again not something that's immediately usable for data analysis. Ultimately, and then there is extracting information from the data. So you have to be able to identify the outliers. Are they relevant or are they due to garbage? This is something that has to be, again, done on a case-by-case basis. Simply excluding outliers can be an easy thing to do at first to test whether there is a relationship between certain input data and the ability to generate an output. But there will be cases where the outliers are relevant, and those have to be analyzed and a determination has to be made whether they are relevant and whether the software is able to handle it and must handle it. Other things include merging data points. So as you bring in patient data from different sources, are they being merged in a way that generates information from that data? If we're merging data from today with different data from a year ago, does the result of that combined data give good information, or does that time frame difference of 1 year generate errors or generates an association that may or may not be valid? So this is another thing that needs to be considered in reviewing the input data. Data security. So a big part of security and HIPAA involves sensitive personal information. So that has to either be removed from the data or segregated somehow, anonymized, and kept separately. The analysis data, generally developers, analysts will need access to it. The sensitive personal information may not be needed, and access should be limited. In a lot of cases, it is discarded and or stored completely separately. So cybersecurity, that introduces several risks, so that would be examined. But malicious or accidental corruption of input data creates a safety risk in the software as a medical device. And malicious or accidental corruption of output data can affect the immediate or future treatment. So if for whatever reason there's a false negative, treatment is delayed. So again, being in the medical device industry, these items are clear, but in the risk analysis that's performed, It's not just securing the software as a medical device, it's also securing the data that is being used to generate the algorithm, validate the algorithm, and produce outputs. Database design. So again, things to consider within the database itself is discarding or limiting access to sensitive personal information, keeping the metadata. The data may be useless without access to the metadata to provide context. There may be free-form text, notes from a clinician that are not machine readable, but if this data point becomes an outlier, having the metadata linked will help with this positioning that outlier. The database should consider how raw data is ingested from multiple sources, different formats, different labels that may mean the same thing, or similar labels that may mean different things. How that data is mapped and sorted into a consistent data set that can now be used for analysis. So how is it going to be stored once the data is ingested and mapped and sorted? Another important consideration is how to select and separate training data from test and verification data, and ensuring that you don't have any selection bias where the test data, for example, the span of the test data may be less than the span of the training data, and would produce a validation result that may seem favorable, but is not actually representative. And then finally, maintaining data, considering maintainability, considering how new data may need to be ingested and merged with existing data. So the database that's used as a basis requires just as much architecture as the medical device itself. And then finally, we come back full circle. So human factors design on the software, reducing input errors. One of the risks is it can result in an incorrect evaluation, but we have to remember the software as a medical device it is a life cycle. So we're going to have a device today that's relying on some previous data, but over the course of its use, we're collecting new data that's going to be used for the next generation of the software algorithm, making it smarter, making it more accurate. So reduction of these data errors so that the next generation of algorithm can be better is critical. Reducing ambiguous data. So free-form text, which everybody's familiar with and is how people just write their thoughts down. Translating that into something machine readable is an important thing to consider, and there's a balance that needs to be met. So asking a clinician to pull down tags from 20 different pull downs when they're trying to treat a patient.
As did I, but I will be leaving in just a second here, okay?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Sounds good. Thanks, Amy.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Go ahead, Jan.
Yeah. Okay, and then finally, just clear and unambiguous output must be used to accurately treat, diagnose, drive, inform. So I think we're kind of at our time limit. don't know if we have any questions.
There is one question that is quite general in relation to software as a medical device, so maybe you have a few words on that. It's how does FDA view AI-based software as medical devices when it comes to design considerations and data management?
Okay, so one of the main things is transparency. So a lot of AI algorithms can demonstrate results, but there is no transparency into how the algorithm works. So AI in itself is a tool, but I'd say the main consideration is when you've developed an algorithm using AI, can you demonstrate the underlying logic, and do you have any transparency in terms of what's going on?
Okay, thank you. I think, well, we have more questions, but we're also out of time. So I think I'm afraid we have to end it here and perhaps post-process the questions if we have a chance.
Okay, great. That's a great
That would
idea.
be-
Thank you, Tim. We'd like to say thank you to Kablooey and also to Jan, who has joined us this morning for this fantastic webinar. We will have those slides available as well as a recording. They're always on our website. And if it's fine with you, Jan and Tom, we'll have people reach out directly to you and you can start a relationship with them as well. Thank you again. It's good to see you, and we're signing off.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank
Farewell.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.